So welcome everyone to this, the second of the Christ's College Climate Seminars of 2022. I see many people joining, and I will just ad lib for a few moments while you do join, because it'll take a while for everybody to connect and for people's connections to fire up. I will say that last week we enjoyed a fascinating discussion between Emily Schuckborough, Director of Cambridge Zero, and Michael Liebrich, who's works in climate finance, about their assessment of COP26 from the perspective of climate science and climate finance. And there was really quite a lively discussion that was in many ways surprisingly positive for some of us about where they felt the world had got to in Glasgow. So I'm going to welcome everybody today to this discussion, which is about the role behaviour change can play in meeting the UK government's net zero targets and strategy. And it's lovely to welcome you to Christ's College and to welcome our three panellists who will each speak briefly to set out their perspective on this question, and then we'll open up to questions. This is in webinar mode, so you'll have to use the Q&A function to put your questions during the course of the discussion, and I'll read them out, and I will do my very best to get through all the questions. And this is being recorded and will be put out published on the CSaP website. So this is a public event, a public forum. So I should introduce myself. I'm Rob Doubleday. I'm Director of the Centre for Science and Policy at Cambridge and a Bi-Fellow at Christ's College. And it's my great pleasure to work with Charlie Kennel, who's the Director Emeritus of the Scripps Oceanographic Institution and a long-standing friend of Christ's College, distinguished visitor and friend of Christ's College, whose inspiration really spurred this series over the last several years. And I know Charlie's joining us from California. Hello, Charlie. It's very nice to have you with us. And so I just wanted to always credit Charlie's insight and humanity in helping shape this interdisciplinary series of discussions. And now I'd like to turn to introduce our three panelists. David Hill, who's joining us from Defra. David Hill is the Director General for Environment, Rural and Marine. So that covers a lot, a very big brief. David, we're very grateful to have you join us. And Lucia Reisch, who is the still new-ish professor, the El-Erian Professor of Behavioural Economics and Policy at Cambridge, who joined just a year ago. And we're very delighted to have you join us. And Theresa Marteau, Professor Dame Theresa Marteau, who is also a Bi-Fellow at Christ's College and Director of the Behaviour and Health Research Unit. So here we have one senior government civil servant responsible, among others, with delivering government's commitment to meet net zero, and two behavioural scientists who are very interested in what insights can the science of behaviour change add to help government and help us all collectively meet these very important goals. So with that, I'll hand over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Rob, and evening, everyone. And it's a real pleasure to be able to join you this evening. As Rob said, I'm David Hill, DG Environment, Rural and Marine in Defra, and my role encompasses leading on the implementation of the government's 25-year environment plan, but also leading for Defra on our Defra's contribution to the government's net zero strategy, and in particular for the natural resources sectors. It's a particular pleasure to join a Cambridge University hosted event, not least because we're about to welcome a Cambridge academic into the department as one of our policy fellows. We're bringing two policy fellows into the department to work with us on behaviour change and the integration of behaviour change into our thinking around the 25-year environment plan. So I thought I'd just say a little bit by way of context about some of the big policy challenges we face and how we're relating those to behaviour change and the role I think behaviour change and behavioural insights can play in achieving some of those goals. So I'll just be very brief in describing some of that sort of policy landscape. The 25-year environment plan makes a really big and bold commitment to the most ambitious environmental programme of any country. Published in 2018, it sets out a plan, a prospectus to improve the environment over a generation across a whole range of environmental outcomes: richer habitats for wildlife, air and water quality, resource efficiency. And with the passage of the Environment Act late last year, much of the legal underpinning for that plan is now in place, and progressively through this year and beyond, we will start to build out from the Act, including introducing legally binding long-term targets for a whole range of environmental outcomes, and we'll be consulting on those shortly. And that work really complements the government's ambitions on net zero. The UK, obviously the first major economy to set a legally binding target to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and putting flesh on the bones of that with the publication of the net zero strategy last year, just ahead of the UK hosting COP26. So some really big ambitions, but we've long recognised the importance of behavioural science in delivering against environmental and climate ambitions. And one of the things I'm really interested in the discussion today is how we weave that into our thinking and how government can best support citizens, consumers, businesses to adopt sustainable behaviours in a way that supports choice, maintains individual freedom, but also helps deliver those outcomes. And in Defra, we first established a centre for expertise on behaviours over 10 years ago. And since then, our strategic behavioural insights team and our analytical teams have played a crucial role in informing how we develop policy in this space. And we know that people want to play their part in tackling climate change and in driving environmental improvement. Research we commissioned last summer on citizen engagement on the environment showed that the public were acutely aware of the need for change and keen to do more. We also know that public concern about climate change is high. The Bayes Public Attitudes Tracker for 2021 shows that public concern has doubled since 2016, with 85% of people in the UK either concerned or very concerned about climate change. And we also know that people and businesses recognise that change needs to happen. Over 80% of respondents in the research I mentioned believe that the way we live our lives will need to change to address the challenges of climate change. So the case for change, I think, is well understood. The challenge is how we make it happen. And in the net zero strategy last year, the government set out 6 principles, and we might debate them this evening, around how government would seek to engage the public and support people in making green choices. The principles are around minimising the ask by sending clear regulatory signals, making green choices easy, making green choices affordable, empowering people and businesses to make their own choices, motivating and building public acceptability for change, and presenting a clear vision of how we get to net zero and what the role of people and business will be. And all of that underpinned by a number of specific commitments in the net zero strategy, including, for example, how we might explore the provision of environmental impact labelling, the use of regulation to make green choices more affordable, and so on. And we're seeking to apply many of those approaches in broader environmental policy as well, and thinking about how do we encourage behaviour change at multiple levels. And that will certainly form an important part of the first 5-yearly review of the 25-year environment plan, which is now required under the Environment Act to take place by January 2023. So the conversation this evening is very timely as we prepare to review and refresh the 25-year environment plan during this year. But where I also see key action already underway. And that would include, for example, the reforms we're bringing in to incentivize changes to land management through the transition of our new environmental land management schemes. So properly rewarding farmers and land managers for their role as environmental stewards and the choices they make around how they best support environmental outcomes. Supporting actions that contribute towards a circular economy, for example, introducing consistency in waste recycling, our work on food waste, the introduction of such schemes as a deposit return scheme, all of which behavioural insights will need to help inform. Improving information to the consumer, for example, around mandatory water efficiency labelling, eco-design standards for stoves for air quality, food labelling, and our emergent work around green finance and leveraging green private finance. So a vast range of work underway, all, I think, with the objective of ensuring that policy is done in an inclusive way, builds public support, and that the costs and benefits are fairly distributed. But to get that right, we absolutely need to work with a whole range of partners: local government, voluntary sector, academia, social enterprises, regulators. And so I think that's a shared challenge, and I really look forward to the discussion this evening about and learning from our panel about some of the insights that might help us address those things. Thank you, Rob.
That's great, David. Thank you. I mean, that again, you've set out the scale and kind of interconnectedness of the kinds of areas that we collectively need to work on, and Defra is helping lead on. I just wonder, and you've mentioned how behaviour change plays a role in that. I mean, can you give us a sense of your view as Defra, or your sense of what proportion of the progress that needs to happen is going to come from people changing their behaviours? You've said it's important. Do you have a sense of how important it is?
So I'm not sure I could quantify it in numerical terms, but I would say it's kind of intrinsic to some of the biggest reforms that we're carrying through. So if I were just to sort of pick one and just highlight the reforms underway to farming outside the Common Agricultural Policy now that we've left the EU. So under the previous regime, farming essentially incentivized production and was done on an acreage, and the incentives were structured on an acreage basis. And we are fundamentally moving to a model of public funds for public goods. And that system will depend crucially on farmers, in this instance, farmers and land managers, making commercial choices about what is good for their business and their livelihoods in ways that will both sustain food production and deliver better environmental outcomes. And that's backed up by over 2 billion of public funding. So that is a big lever. It's also a big change, and it has to make sense to farmers and be intuitive for farmers and align with things that make sense for them and their families and their livelihoods. So how we can best support farmers with good information, good advice, and the incentives to make those choices, I think, is absolutely fundamental to something that actually will then deliver a whole range of environmental benefits. So that's one example, Rob.
That's interesting. I mean, so it's not that the behaviour change isn't sort of one slice of the pie, but it's sort of integrated across all the sorts of change that you see being needed. Well, you can come back on that if that's it.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I mean, I'd be interested in the debate, but I wouldn't sort of, as it were, sort of see behaviour change as a kind of, as it were, an initiative sort of in its own right. I would see it as something that needs to be integrated across a whole range of quite diverse policies and programs.
Well, and
it's an enabler. And I'm sure there are elements of consistent practice, but it needs to be woven throughout our work.
Well, I think that's a very nice point at which to hand over to Lucia and to hear your perspective from behavioural economics and policy on the sorts of challenges David's been setting out.
Yes, thanks so much for having me, and yeah, good evening to all of you. Just maybe to add something what David just said, I mean, from a demand side point of view, we know that if we only look at climate change, so climate gases in the food sector, depending on how you measure it, but about a third of the greenhouse gas emissions is actually linked to demand, to consumption. And that's quite a lot, just because you ask, how much kind of in figures, we should be worried and should be, focus also on the demand side. And this is something that is, I think, comparatively new, because for a long, long time in climate policy or food policy, the focus was definitely on the supply side. And although we know it's always the whole system, there has been not so much focus, maybe in the UK, but in the rest of Europe has not been so much focus on the demand side. So, I want to make 3 points. The first is actually pretty basic, and so I want to ask, why is the behavioral perspective of demand so relevant? And it's obviously so relevant that it's now also will become, or is included in a chapter of the next IPCC report, the AR6, will have an own chapter on demand side and demand side policies. And well, the reason is, we know that decision makers, which is consumers, but also policymakers and all the other actors, are not econs, right? They're humans. If they would be econs, they would just do the math, weigh costs and benefits, and not discount the future too much and do the right thing. But we know empirically from many, many years of research that people do not adhere to the axioms of rationality, and we systematically do kind of violate those rationality axioms, and we rather satisfy than optimize or maximize. We use heuristics, rule of thumb. Often consumers also do not even want to know, even if they could, because there's this thing of like blissful ignorance, because some information makes us really unhappy. So it might not make sense just to provide more, even better information, but also kind of, we have to probably also increase the motivation to make use of the information. And I mean, we all know about all those biases that have been discussed for years. And maybe just because we talk about climate and climate change, a few of those biases seem to be pretty hardwired in the sense of really robust also across cultures. And one of them is short-sightedness or present bias, if you want. And that's, of course, very counterproductive, talking about long-term changes and long-term goals as in climate change. A second one is our need to kind of feel, touch, smell, experience, sometimes fear our environment and kind of the salience as if used to act. And I would say until the past year, climate change was for many a rather distant thing, a distant concept, at least for most of the wealthy part of the world, something that happened elsewhere or later, and sometimes in later land. And I think this has changed and might also kind of somehow be a helpful side effect of this last year of extreme weather events. The third one is status thinking. That seems also to be pretty much, innate major driver of our consumption consumer society, but also wastes a lot of resources just climbing the social ladder. And this is something that, it seems to be innate, but I also think can be harnessed because status can also provide it with other things than material goods. And maybe the fourth point that is really kind of, on the one hand, an innate bias, but could also be harnessed is herd behavior. We are deeply social animals. We adhere to social norms, particularly newly established ones, so-called dynamic norms. They tend to spread, they tend to be impactful. And when we look at, again, the last 20 months and look at the pandemic, we see, yes, norms can change. We don't know how lasting this will be, but norms and habits can change. So I think I mean, I've been working on behavioral change for many, many years, but I think the last 24 months have brought indeed a few new insights, or have made things that at least I thought we know, open up them a little bit again. So my second point is, which behavioral interventions tend to be effective? And there is, luckily now, after 20 years of research, we know quite a bit. We don't know a lot, and there's fields where we still have research gaps, but we know there's like 3 categories of those, call it nudges. One is more educative, so warnings, reminders, disclosure of information, labels, priming. The second category, architectural, so choice architecture, curation of the infrastructure, like automatic enrollment, mandatory choice, sludge reduction, design of websites, and so on. And then there's those self-control, self-nudges, if you want, so implementation intentions and pledges. And as I said, I think now that we have some pretty solid evidence, at least in a few behavioral fields, we know that particularly those architectural, like automatic enrollment, for instance, or changing the environment, these are nudges that seem to work on average pretty well and do have sizable effects. And just citing 2 recent studies, one is published in Nature Human Behavior, found that large and persistent effects of green energy defaults, that's something I've been working myself a lot with. That was a huge study in Switzerland. So 80% of the customers stayed with a green default, and that was actually stable over 4 years. So that's quite substantial. And then another paper that I thought is really, really interesting is also recently published, looked at a whole range, more than 200 interventions and more than 200 nudges conducted by both nudge units in the US and also published studies and academic papers. And while there was a big difference between those 2 types of studies as regards the effect, both showed that those different behavioral interventions have sizable effects. The difference is largely explained by something called publication bias. So the likelihood that a study is written up and published, and a study that has positive effects, is much, much higher, about 10-fold higher. But still, overall, we know more or less they work. It will always depend how good they are, whether kind of the hand fits the glove, and whether they're done well and fit the target group, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, there is hope. Let's put it this way. And my last point, a bit, I mean, if we know, those tools work, will that be enough? And being a behavioral economist and behavioral public policy person, I often get confronted with this thing of, you guys, you're telling us everything should be behavioral, and then, can you really nudge us to zero? And of course we cannot. And that's something that also I know Theresa is never tired to put into perspective, because of course there are deep global disruptive transformations underway. It's not just climate change. We have biodiversity loss, pandemics, and many, many other critical things. And in some of those crises, we're close to the tipping points. And of course, we know those behavioral approaches will not be enough. We need kind of all tools that we have. So kind of all hands on board, and we can discuss what else is out there. But let me stay with the behavioral interventions for now. I think we can do 3 things with what we know about the behavioral interventions. And first is include those that have proved to be highly effective, where the level of evidence is good, that are easy to implement and highly acceptable. We must include them in the overall toolbox. And of course, always check for unintended side effects, particularly distributive effects. Second, We can make the classical policy approaches more effective and also more acceptable when we kind of factor in the human factor, if you want. So for instance, a behaviorally informed carbon tax with a climate bonus system, something that is currently discussed in Germany, is probably more effective and more useful than one that is not behaviorally informed. And then third, I also think that it makes sense, something that has been going on in the UK for long. I know that very well, but there are other countries in Europe and worldwide that are not at this level, but develop more behavioral skills and knowledge at all levels. And it's so incredibly important to take also the perspective of the different target groups and be able to explain why, for instance, the take up of really good and attractive schemes is comparatively low. I mean, just thinking of, for instance, the latest UK scheme to improve heating efficiency and substitute those gas boilers with more efficient heat pumps. Thank you.
That's really a fantastic, I think, overview of some of the sort of core tenets of the behavioral approach and what we know about what works so far and how it can connect with other approaches. And I'm sure that there'll be lots of, I've already seen there's some quite concrete questions in the Q&A, which we'll come to, which I think might, develop the conversation nicely. But before we do that, I'd like to turn to Theresa to comment on this question about how to, well, I'll leave it to you, Theresa. Comment on whatever you want to comment on.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks very much to David and Lucia, who set out the different and overlapping complementary perspectives. And what I want to do is just touch on a couple of points and end on what we can learn and should learn from other major attempts to change behavior at scale. So David asked a good question and gave a great answer well, rather you asked the question, Rob, in terms of how much behavior change do we need? How much of the emissions reduction will be down to behavior change? And as David and really Lucia has said, behavior change runs through all the ambitions that we have, and it's not just the behavior of the citizen, it's the behavior of all the actors in this, so the businesses as well as those in governments. But to put a number on it, and people have attempted to put a number on this, it's estimated that in the last 10 years, emissions reduction in the UK, which has been impressive along with many other countries in the EU, 87% of that was down to technology, and in particular, green energy. So as using Lucia's language, supply side. So people didn't really have to make many changes themselves. But it's estimated that for the next 15 years, that the technology is going to deliver about 40% of the emissions rather, and the rest will be a combination of either pure behavior change or changing. So pure behavior change might be walking and cycling, whereas behavior change in combination with technologies such as buying electric vehicles. So behavior change is critical. We can't achieve it without that. My second point is the way that I'm thinking about behavior change is not in terms of the intervention, but the outcome. So for me, as Lucia intimated, I'm very liberal in terms of my definition. So anything that changes behavior, I'm calling a behavior change intervention. So it could be a fiscal intervention to increase the affordability.
We have a slight glitch with Theresa's connection. We'll give it a moment to see if it connects again. Well, we'll have to pause a little bit and hear perhaps more from Theresa in a moment. Yes, I think we will. I might turn now and to some of the questions, because I think that they really relate directly to some of the points Theresa was making. So we could, for example, try and illustrate the question by looking at specifics. And we've got a question, for example, I might start with the fourth question that came in from Graham Pendlebury, who is a fellow of the Centre for Science and Policy and was until recently a director for local transport in the Department for Transport. And so he is using examples of how, I think David and Lucia can see his question in the Q&A, can you? So Graham, talking about bringing down road casualties with what he calls the 3 E's, which is engineering, education, and enforcement. And so he's asking, the question is, does the panel think that behaviour change is anywhere near enough without other measures to deliver sustainable climate change mitigation, to deliver sustainability? I think we've sort of begun to answer that question, but I might turn to Lucia first briefly, and then David for your perspectives on that question.
Yeah, the clear answer is that behavior change has to be embedded, enforced, motivated, reminded, and also promoted by the very context. So it's not gonna, behavior change does not happen by itself or out of the blue. We are heavily context dependent in our decisions. And as David said in the beginning, and listing those 6 principles of the Defra plan, or that's very clear. So the easier, for instance, the choice is to the more sustainable, the safer choice, the better. Maybe one example, I lived the last 20 years in Copenhagen, and Copenhagen is famous for, its traffic and kind of bike-centered and active travel schemes, and people really do that. And the reason is, if you ask people, and there's a bike strategy since 20 years, and there's a bike mayor, and a lot of infrastructure has been built to support that trend, is really not about the environment or about health. It's really about people save time, because there was a whole bundle of measures that also included parking management within the inner city. So, even if you there's no way to put your car, if you would have a car and would like to take it. And then there is an intricate system of slowing down car traffic in the city, et cetera, plus excellent bike lanes, safe bike lanes. So it's a whole bundle. And particularly if you tackle not the easy behavior change, but more difficult ones. And daily commuting, that's a more difficult one. That means you have to really build on changing habits. And they say you probably have to do that about 50 times before it really becomes a habit. So this is where all the supportive infrastructure comes in. And plus there's another thing I just saw that the UK has changed is kind of the code for, traffic code, to change the hierarchy and I read it and I thought, that's not going to work. What is really needed is again, tipping points. In cities where you have about 50% of the daily commutes are really by bike or other type of walking, pedestrian active mobility, then also the whole thinking, the mental models and the hierarchy of actors, they change. And all these together is actually needed. And it's never wrong. It's good to have it, and information is good, and changing values is good. It's just, it doesn't change behavior.
Yeah.
Sorry for being so long.
No, it's perfect. We're in danger of all very much agreeing with each other and the question. So this, Theresa, is in response to Graham Pendlebury's question about road safety, bringing together the kind of educative, the enforcement, and the engineering. I wondered if you wanted to just finish your points, and then we'll.
Yes, if I could. I'm so sorry. I just got thrown off. just on that small point, and then I'll come back to finish my point. I was reading an analysis recently that slightly went against what was being said, and it surprised me as well, that it's often, of course, it's always more than one thing, but in this particular analysis, looking at cycling, one of the questions is, why is it safer to cycle in cities where more people cycle? Is it safety in numbers and so on? And it was felt that actually primary to more people cycling is safe infrastructure. And I very much hope that Active Travel England is going to be building separate pathways for cycling and also for walking, because it's more dangerous to cycle and walk than it is to travel for each mile by traveling by car. Anyway, sorry, just to go back to the points that I was making. So I was saying that depending on the behavior, but if we think in particular about land travel and diets, which together are estimated to explain globally about 38% of emissions. So they're really important clusters of behaviors. It's about changing the environments which cue, reinforce and maintain these behaviors, which is what Lucia was saying. As David's also said, and Lucia, we need to engage publics, and we can come on to evidence-based ways of engaging publics in this. And we also need to engage businesses, and two things to say about that. One is there needs to be partnership, and that's something that is spoken about a lot. But we also need to protect public policy from corporate interference. And Merchants of Doubt is a book that I'm sure many people taking part in this webinar will have heard of, where Naomi Oreskes describes how fossil fuel industries and tobacco industries, and we also have much more evidence accumulated, can interfere and in ways that undermine policy. I just want to say two things, Rob, before I stop. Just as I said at the very beginning, this isn't the first time that we've had a large-scale ambition for changing behaviour, but it's probably the biggest. So if we look at, let's see what we can learn from tobacco control and our obesity strategies. So tobacco control is generally considered a success story, and indeed it is. If we think 60 years ago, when the Royal College of Physicians report 1962 was first published, making it very clear that smoking kills, that since at that time 75% of men in this country smoked, 50% of women, the numbers are now down to 15% of men and around 12% of women. So that is huge. We still have a large gap between those who are rich and poor who are smoking. So that we tend to, the story we tell ourselves is this is a success story. But last year, the Royal College of Physicians in their follow-up report described it as an abject failure of public policy. And the reason for that is they estimated that if the policies that were recommended in the 1962 report had been followed, then we would have been smoke-free decades ago. And at the moment, government has an ambition for us to be smoke-free by 2030. And in that report, they estimate that we're missing it by at least 2 decades. And a number of recommendations, but one of the key ones that they make is, in order to catch up, pricing interventions. There are many interventions that are important. The pricing one is really important, that we need to decrease the affordability of tobacco. So double the price in the next 5 years, but increase the affordability of nicotine substitutes. So this is if you like, a sort of broad behavioural strategy, which is going to be relevant in net zero. And the other thing that they point to is the need to protect policy making. And it's shocking to read that in this country, the tobacco industry is still attempting, with varying degrees of success, to interfere with effective policy making. Secondly, when it comes to obesity, I don't think any of us would tell ourselves a success story on that, although there have been some successes. And colleagues in Cambridge, Dolly Theus and Martin White, conducted a fascinating analysis of obesity strategies in this country over the last 30 years, of which there have been 14 and nearly 700 policies. And as most people will be aware, rates of obesity are high and rising, most distressingly in our children, and particularly amongst those in the most deprived areas. So the bottom line, and I'll wrap up here, is that one of the problems is that many of the policies have been weak and not implemented or evaluated well. We have a vision or an ambition, I'm not sure which it is, and there must be an ambition to halve childhood obesity by 2030. Short of a miracle, there's no way we're going to achieve that. So the bottom line from those examples, I think there are three takeaways that I think it's absolutely essential that we learn from in terms of what will be an even bigger project to change behaviour. And the first is, we've got to act rapidly. We can't have loads of pilot studies that are being, rolled out. We've got to act now to halve our emissions by 2030. And it needs to be far more ambitious than any of us feel comfortable with. But importantly, it's got to be multiple interventions that are evidence-based, that are taking the interventions that we've already heard some of today, that have the largest effect sizes. And thirdly, we need to evaluate, we need to design in the evaluations so that we are very agile with that. We check in every so often to see whether we're on course or we're missing it by a mile, and changing what we're doing as part of a delivery strategy. So I think there are great lessons, and we have had some success in all of that. But that tells us it's not simple, and we've got to be coordinated. Thanks, Rob.
Well, great. Thank you, Lucia and Theresa. So David, you've set out the big sort of challenges government are working on, and it's clear from Lucia and Theresa that behavioural science isn't just a sort of little bit that can contribute to the overall. But we've heard from Lucia that there is a lot of evidence about how behavior change can happen. And Lucia's final points, and then Theresa's points, of course, is that these are part of a system that can work well or can not work. And so how do you reflect on what we've heard, David?
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion, and I might reflect on it partly by coming back to the question that my former civil service colleague Graham Pendlebury posed, and it's nice to hear from Graham again, which was essentially around, do you need a mix of things for policy to be effective in achieving the outcome you're seeking to achieve? And I think that's right, and I'll just sort of illustrate that, I think, with one example, if I may, from our current work on air quality. So Defra and Department for Transport have a joint programme which is about reducing NO2 emissions in areas where there are exceedances of legal limits around the country, so typically city centres. And one element of the policy and how we achieve that is about charging. It's about charging motorists, drivers of older, dirtier vehicles, more polluting vehicles to drive into those zones. So there's a kind of direct financial charge there. I think sort of picking up on what Theresa and I think Graham's question is posing is, if that was all we did and it was simply a question of the charge, how effective would that policy be? I think my answer would be not that effective, because there'd be the public acceptance of that policy would be pretty limited. I think it would be quite controversial. It would be difficult to sort of secure compliance. And so there are other elements to the policy package here. One element is another financial element, which is about direct support for residents and businesses to support the choices they make, for example, to upgrade a vehicle to a cleaner vehicle, or to provide direct support to businesses operating in the local zone. So there's something about where the costs fall, but also where the support comes to support residents and businesses in making positive choices that help improve the environmental outcome. But I think the other thing that I learned from talking to one of the local authorities, a big urban Met authority, was about finding interlocutors who are trusted by residents and who can help explain what difference the policy in question will make to them. And in the case of this big urban Met in the north of England, what they found was actually local hospital to talk about the health benefits of cleaner air in the city centre was the thing that kind of got cut through with local residents in a way that, frankly, the local authority comms, the government comms, etc., just hadn't. Charging the financial support, finding trusted interlocutors who are able to sort of draw out for people why might this thing be of benefit to them and their health and their family's health. All those things together were mutually reinforcing, and I would certainly agree with the premise of Graham's question that you take any one of those things away, less impactful. And so I think thinking about public acceptability, thinking about direct financial incentives, and thinking about making choices easier together is sort of how we unlock some of it.
That's very helpful, David.
Could I just jump in to, oh, sorry.
Yeah, Theresa, I'm also trying to get through as many questions as we can.
Sorry.
So maybe can I ask you a question, Theresa, and allow you to use that perhaps to comment as well on what David said. And it's a question from another CSaP policy fellow, Richard Harries, who is at the Institute for Community Studies. And he raises the important question, which is that, as he says, transition to net zero is likely, he claims, to have disproportionate impacts for families in or close to poverty. What does the evidence show about the effectiveness of behaviour change policies in more deprived communities? Theresa.
It's a really good question, because we've talked about acceptability, and acceptability, there's good evidence, experimental evidence, that people will shift, publics will shift their support for policies that for which there's evidence of effectiveness. But fairness and perceived fairness is also absolutely critical. And if we look at behaviour change policies, interventions, they have the potential to increase inequalities, particularly if they are targeted at individuals, and require a lot of agency or personal resource, which is often wiped out by having to focus on poverty and getting from one end of the day to the other. And if I could just add to what David was saying earlier in terms of thinking about transport policies, I think we've got thinking about Paris, the 15-minute city. So I would encourage David and others to be more radical in thinking about the redesign of infrastructure and affordability. So it's important that public transport systems are more affordable than driving your car, however clean your car is. And at the moment, it's still cheaper to drive by car than often to use public transport, particularly trains. So it's affordability as well as ease, accessibility, being able to have plans within towns and systems where this is joined up. And we heard a lot of rehearsal about this yesterday with the Levelling Up paper, with some of those cities and towns where the transport system just doesn't work. So it's about affordability as well as having these things working. And in thinking about biodiversity as well, having attractive green spaces so people want to go out there. Yeah.
So I'm just going to try and go through as many questions as we can. I will come back to Lucia in a moment. But David, just while we're on this inequalities sort of discussion, Carol Brain, who's a professor of public health medicine, in a way asks the same question again. But I just want to give you the chance to come in, David, in thinking about the distributional dimension. You know, how are you thinking about you know, managing the demand side, as it were, and that's potential impact on the distributional effects of climate change policies?
So I think the distributional impacts are kind of critical in a whole range of kind of climate and environment policy, you know, a number of points being made. Richard Harry's made the point in his question about, you know, for those relatively more disadvantaged, that the impacts of net zero policies would fall disproportionately on them. And we, you know, I see the same sort of dynamic at play in, you know, the example I gave earlier, for example, around air quality. You know, some of the policy measures we take could have disproportionate impact unless mitigated on, you know, those, for example, who rely on you know, being able to drive in a city centre for their work, for their lifestyle. So we have to sort of factor that in, think about those distributional impacts, and think about what mitigations we can develop, which in this instance was direct support to particular sort of groups of businesses and so forth. I think there's also something really important about how we use and evaluate good, you know, data to understand where those inequalities may arise. So I was really struck, for example, during the pandemic. So part of my role is sponsorship of national parks, and we saw a huge growth in the early days of the pandemic in people visiting our national parks, including a colossal growth in first-time visitors to national parks. And we did quite a lot of work and research around, you know, public attitudes and and there are great inequities in terms of you know, one's access to green space depending on where you live and whether you're relatively more or less disadvantaged. And so what, you know, having that data and sort of spotting that trend has been really valuable in terms of then thinking about, well, how can we create and support new green space, including urban green space, closer to people in relative disadvantage. But we rely on that rely on intelligent and good data and social trends data to be able to tailor the policy accordingly. But if we can target that effectively, then I think it starts to address some of the distributional effects that have been highlighted.
Yeah. Thank you. Lucia, do you want to come in on this? And then I've got a particular question for you.
Okay. Yes, I think I would like to briefly comment on the inequality and distributive justice. I mean, first, yes, I mean, behavioral interventions do have the potential also to have unintended, also redistributional effects that we don't want. Looking at like renewable energy defaults, if the renewable energy tariff is more expensive, for instance. I mean, there are those issues, but I would say Good governance of such behavioral interventions takes that into account, and I mean, kind of looks and where are they? Who is helped? Who pays for it? How is the net income for those who need the support the most, kind of the poorest? And yeah, so that's one point. I don't think that behavioral instruments are any different from other policy instruments. I mean, also other classical instruments have the potential to have unintended distributional side effects. So it's just a thing of being aware of it and including it in the evaluation, something that Theresa really made this point is so important to really check, not just pilot test, but kind of stay in the loop. And that's also the specifics of behavioral public policy. Really go back, really get the data and improve and learn from the people, talk to the people, talk to the neighborhood councils and consult with them. And then my third point on inequality is I think it goes really deeper. I mean, in those countries where inequality is, well, that are more equal, talking like Nordic countries. So just looking at the Gini coefficient, there's a huge difference in how public infrastructure, kind of public goods, is actually valued, and where people are more willing to pay higher taxes because they see it's actually used. I mean, you can actually experience that, what it does to the public good, and this is very different from other countries where I see more kind of the private riches and public poverty. So this is at the, I think it goes actually much deeper. And yeah, let's stop here.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, again, Theresa and David, I mean, you do wave if you want to come in on those points. I mean, there's so many, so many issues that you're bringing up that are quite, as I keep saying, they're quite cross-cutting and general, but it's very interesting where the sort of behavioral science sensibilities and research and evidence kind of inform that more cross-cutting way of thinking about public policy. But I do want to get to a few of the specific questions, and this may be one for you, Lucia, which is from Anne Miller from the Creativity Partnership, who I know Anne is one of those who's been to many of the Christ's climate seminars over the years. So this is the 9th year of them, and I know Anne's been to many. Wow. And Anne asks, well, I'll just pick her most specific question, which is around sort of plant-based diets. So, how you taking this particular question, if we believe that shifting diets is an important part of the story, how do we do it? Lucia first, and then perhaps David might comment.
Yeah, we're looking for the silver bullet here, but maybe I can share. We started a project last summer together with the city of Copenhagen, and now we also work with the city of New York. They have a new mayor, Eric Adams, who is vegan and who is very ambitious in not just having a meatless Monday in the schools, but also going largely plant-based in all the public hospitals and many other public canteens. So there is a big movement in some of the most, I would say, innovative cities worldwide. And what we try to do is to do, of course, again, a lot of things, work with cities. Why? Because that's a very good level of governance in the sense of large enough to really have an impact and to really motivate shifts, and also to do kind of, hard, these are hard defaults. There's not a choice, but there are meatless Mondays in schools, for instance. And they are, changes can be made if there's political interest and budget for it. They are often responsible for this whole infrastructure setting in schools, in hospitals, in cities. They're often responsible for those public canteens, and they can also, because of the size or the level of governance, it's realistic to test on-spot policies, or, and also improve after feedback. So in some ways, cities are kind of living labs where you can really, really learn a lot. And help to, sometimes they can also, they have an impact on prices. So maybe they cannot really introduce carbon prices. But for instance, what we also try is to work with true cost pricing together with some supermarkets. So people would have in those pilot supermarkets the original price plus a true cost price of meat, for instance, or animal protein products, showing the external effects, the external costs. So these are things you can do in a kind of smaller environment of a city. Yeah, of course, that comes with campaigns and the typical classical instruments. I think what is really key is to have some promoters in powerful promoters who can, because there is of course always a power game, particularly if you start to deal with meat. There's a huge industry behind, and the system of provision specifically for meat is often in most countries highly well, there are cartels in meat packing, and it's really powerful. So you need also a powerful person to not just counter nudge, but also make some pretty bold decisions. And yeah, I mean, I've not talked about everything that we do with consumers, but that's more or less kind of the usual, usual nudging stuff with priming and defaults and labels and stuff.
That's a great illustration of some of the issues. David.
Thanks, Rob. So I said a little bit in my opening piece about future farming policy, all geared around enabling farmers to basically optimize sustainable food production and reduce emissions from agriculture. So the context for, from my perspective, is that fundamental reform sort of underway. And of course, in many of the things I've been talking about, what is government trying to do? It's trying to enable people to make it as easy as possible for people to shift towards a greener and more sustainable lifestyle, but also maintain people's freedom of choice, and that includes their diet. And so, there is government advice available. So the provision of advice is important. For example, the Eat Well guide, that's about giving people good information about how to have a more healthier, more sustainable diet, recommending food that's high in fiber, fruit and vegetables, and so on. Less focus on red meat. But important to recognise, well-managed livestock does have a part to play in supporting biodiversity, protecting the character of the countryside, important for the income of rural communities. So I think that takes me back to some of what I was trying to say earlier about finding a balanced approach to policy, which acknowledges that part of effective behaviour change is public acceptability, and I think therefore it's important to give people good information so they can make their own choices, but also recognise that there are multiple objectives that are in play here.
Yeah, thanks, David. And Theresa.
Yes, thanks. I'm not against information. I work in an information economy, working in a university. But if you want to change behaviour, that's not where you'd start. And in fact, millions and millions of pounds and dollars have been spent, US, UK, trying to encourage us to eat more fruit and vegetables. And they were terribly effective at increasing our awareness, but they absolutely flatlined in terms of changing our behaviour. So the question about how to shift diets, actually evidence is really pretty good. And I want to give one example from our own university of effective change, whereby the Cambridge University Catering Service implemented a sustainable food policy in 2016. They evaluated it in 2019. And there were 4 main components to this. One was just taking ruminant meat off the menu, sourcing fish sustainably, reducing food waste, and increasing the proportion of vegan and vegetarian meals available. It was evaluated reduction in carbon emissions per kilogram of food that was served down by 33%, amount of meat that was purchased down by 37%, and profits up by 2%. So they didn't make a loss. So my question is, that is absolutely fantastic and well done, University of Cambridge. That's 14 cafeterias. What about the colleges in Cambridge? We haven't done that. What about all other universities? What about all schools? Why are we spending money out of the public purse on unhealthy and unsustainable food? And I don't want to put David on the spot, but thinking about Defra, I don't know, last time you went to work, what the cafeteria was like. So we've got, and that's not the only evidence we have, just by shifting the availability in other work, going from 3 out of 4 meals that are meat-based to 2 out of 4, you can increase the proportion of people by 15 percentage points who select a vegetable-based meal. So you haven't removed choice, you've shifted what's available, people don't complain, they still go. So we've got to move fast. So how do we scale that up? Are people meant to just sort of read this somewhere, and an enlightened catering manager might think, oh, maybe we'll do that, maybe we won't. So I think it's a big question about, we know what can shift some of the really important behaviours. How are we going to, do we want to coordinate this, or are we going to leave it to chance?
I don't know, David, if you want to come back on what are some of the kind of barriers that to making the sort of interventions Theresa's talking about.
So, I mean, I think I don't think we're that far apart, because I think I heard you say it's not about removing choice, and I think that's kind of at the heart of the government's approach on this. The government is not in the business of sort of dictating what people should or shouldn't eat, and sustainably produced meat is part of what we seek to promote. I think that the key here is about finding policy interventions that resonate with the public, and that the public see as attractive for them, and that's not just in question of food and diet, but is right across the span of public policy. And that's why I think the sort of mix of things we were talking about before, financial, behavioural, they all have to be reinforcing each other. But there is a risk you get too far out ahead of public opinion, I think, in my view.
Thank you. I mean, we're just really kind of getting close to the end, and I do want to bring in 1 or 2 more people. So I know that I think we're being joined from Australia by Jim Falk, who is a colleague of Charlie Kennel's. So I wanted to ask if Jim actually wanted to come and ask his question, because his question related, in my mind, to some of the broader cross-cutting themes about how policy is done. So Jim, you asked, your first question was really about the political process and politicians. I don't know if you want to just put it quite succinctly, and we'll hear from the sort of responses.
Well, I was just actually contemplating the point that we've been focusing on the firm and the individual to an extent. But of course, once behaviour change, we really begin to understand it. It goes also to decision makers and policy makers. And I was wondering, first of all, if there are tools that have been applied to decision makers and policy makers. Of course, that raises a tricky question about democracy, but democracy is a constant tug of war with people trying to influence decision makers. There's a bit of an idea that decision makers, particularly politicians, are chasing votes, and that's their prime motivation. That may be as unrealistic as the economic rational actor. And finally, a question about if once you start to think about states, they also seek to influence each other. So, for example, the UK could be doing something to nudge the Australian government towards more effective policies in reducing emissions, holding back coal and so forth. Is there work on this which would be helpful in trying to achieve a better global community?
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Well, that's a big question, but I mean, where might I start? I might start maybe with David. You know, in some sense, you know, as a civil servant, you are thinking about how, you know, how you apply, you know, good practice and good evidence to how government works. I mean, how would you respond to Jim's question?
Yeah, I mean, I think, how would I respond? I mean, you know, giving a sort of intending to give a formulaic answer, and Rob, I think you sort of, you know, good evidence is at the heart of good policy making. So, you know, I would always hope that we would seek to ensure that our evidence base and our process for assembling evidence informs our policy making. But I also think kind of, you know, an openness in policy making is important too, and policy making that actively engages, you know, a very broad cross-section of society in the development of policy and the formulation of policy is really important. And I was quite struck many years ago when I worked in the Department of Energy and Climate Change, soon after the passage of the UK's Climate Change Act, and we developed for the first time, you know, an online carbon calculator, for example, which allowed people to basically play with the calculator online about different choices you could make about your energy mix, and what that would look like in terms of public policy outcomes. And that was, you know, it's 10 years ago now, but it was at the time, it was quite an innovative way of engaging people in some of the choices that policymakers were having to make, point one, and point two, actually was helpful to policymakers in seeing how different people were sort of approaching those choices, and they were real choices that had to be made. So I think there is something about the openness and the techniques you use to actively engage a broader cross-section of society in the choices that you make. So I hope that answers the question, Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a very open question, and that's an absolutely interesting and important response. Theresa, and then Lucia, and maybe you could use these also, because looking at the time, as a sort of to a wrap up. You know, respond if you wish to Jim, and then wrap up.
Okay, thanks, Jim, for your question. I think it's a great question, and some have described this as policy inertia, where we've got quite a lot of evidence and somehow we don't see it coming through in policy terms. I think active engagement with people is absolutely vital, as David is suggesting, and in a democracy, it's good to see that politicians still have an interest in what populations are thinking and what they want. And one of our speakers at last year's series was Audrey Tang, who is the digital minister in Taiwan. And Audrey Tang is a radical transparency person. And in Taiwan, they've got fantastic platforms that are being developed, whereby I think over half the population have engaged with policy, and so I think that's one thing. And the second, the second thing I would say is what pushes policymakers off kilter are the powerful commercial corporate determinants that are acting in their own interests. So we need to have a powerful way of protecting policies that are in evidence-based and engaging publics.
Thank you, Theresa. And Lucia, you have about a minute for your final comment.
final minute. Yeah, I've done some work on good governance of nudging, if you want, and we heard about, and some of the elements are, of course, has to be effective, fair, not sneaky, definitely transparent, definitely welfare enhancing. checking for side effects, have participative elements in it for many different reasons, also for democratic reasons. And maybe also something new. We talk a lot about evidence. There is this new thing called live reviews that came up now with a pandemic. So even further improve the access and ease the access of policymakers to where do we actually stand, which level of evidence do we have, and then just make it possible for them to also be able to argue for the choices, the policy choices they made.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to everybody for joining, and some excellent questions we didn't get to, but I know that people will have had the chance to read them. I just want to end by reading out the essence of Charlie Kennel's question, which I think is quite an interesting one to leave everyone with, which is to what extent can we think of behavioral change as a tool to achieve, predetermined, perhaps even technocratic ends, and to what extent, Charlie asks, do we need to think more fundamentally about the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of societies that actually we're trying to will into being? So that's quite a big question for Charlie, which I think we can leave people with. But really, I just want to end by saying huge thanks to David for coming to join us. I hope some of this has been stimulating for you, and we certainly all wish you every success in your tasks of trying to help us all navigate towards the net zero societies. And huge thanks to Lucia and Theresa for your really enlightening and quite uplifting set of comments on what is known and what is possible, and even some of the things that we know are hard, but some of the ways that we can make progress. So with that, I'd like to say goodbye and thank you. Bye.